I was standing in the hallway holding a basket of freshly folded towels when my son looked me directly in the eyes and muttered, "Leaving you was the smartest decision I ever made." Less than 10 said. Seconds later, his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, his annoyed expression melting into a warm, eager smile. He answered on the first ring. "Hi, Mom." David chimed, his tone dripping with a fake sweetness I hadn't heard since he was a teenager wanting a new video game. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to Vivian, his mother-in-law. For a brief moment, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside my Seattle home seemed to completely stop. I didn't drop the laundry basket. I didn't burst into tears. At 64 years old, I had survived the loss of my husband and the task of raising a child entirely on my own. I wasn't about to crumble over a cruel sentence. Instead, I simply watched my 30-year-old son pace around my living room, thanking Vivian profusely for the amazing opportunity to move into the guest wing of her new estate. David and his wife, Sarah, had been living in my 4-bedroom house rent-free for almost 3 years. The original agreement was simple: stay for 12 months, save up for a down payment, and build their own life. But 12 months turned into 24 and then 36. Their savings account remained a mystery while their daily Amazon packages piled up on my front porch. I watched David end the call and turn back to me expecting a reaction. He wanted me to beg him to stay. He needed to feel like leaving was a devastating blow to my lonely, pathetic existence. I placed the towels neatly on the hallway table. "What time is the moving truck arriving tomorrow?" I asked calmly. David blinked, clearly thrown off balance by my dry response. But he had no idea that his words had just set a timer. To understand how we reached that moment, you have to look back at the past 3 years. It didn't fall apart overnight. The disrespect crept in quietly like water seeping through a cracked foundation. At first, Sarah was overly polite. She bought me cheap candles and thanked me for cooking. But within 6 months, my home stopped feeling like mine. I would wake up to find my expensive ceramic pans scratched because Sarah used metal spatulas on them. When I brought it up, she simply rolled her eyes. "It's just a pan, Bethany. We can buy you another one at Target." They never did. Then came the living room. One afternoon, I returned from the grocery store to find my favorite floral armchair missing. Sarah had dragged it out to the garage, replacing it with a hard, modern gray love seat she found on a clearance rack. "The old one smelled like dust," she explained without looking up from her phone. "This fits our aesthetic better." Our aesthetic. In the house my late husband and I worked 30 years to pay off. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. Arguing with people who lack basic respect is like trying to teach a cat to bark, exhausting and entirely pointless. Instead, I quietly dragged my chair into my master bedroom and installed a heavy-duty lock on my door. That was the first boundary. When Sarah complained that she couldn't get into my bathroom to use my expensive shampoos, I merely smiled. "Privacy is important for everyone," I replied, pouring myself a cup of black coffee. They treated me like an invisible maid, assuming I would always keep the fridge stocked, the Wi-Fi paid, and the utility bills handled while they lived like teenagers in a dorm. David's cruel declaration in the hallway wasn't a sudden heartbreak. It was the final drop in a glass that had been overflowing for a very long time. As I walked away from him that afternoon, I realized something wonderful. I was finally free. I didn't spend that evening crying over old photo albums. I spent it sitting at my kitchen island with my laptop open and a cup of peppermint tea resting beside the mouse. David and Sarah had announced they were moving out in 3 days. Vivian had purchased a massive house in a wealthy suburb and offered them the entire finished basement. David believed he was upgrading. He believed he was leaving me in the dust. He entirely forgot how many invisible strings were attached to my bank account. First, I opened my family cellular plan. David and Sarah's numbers had been on my account for years. I clicked remove lines and confirmed the changes. They would have service until midnight. Next, I logged into my auto insurance portal. David's sedan was still bundled with my policy because he insisted it saved him $100 a month. With 2 simple clicks, his vehicle was removed. Finally, I canceled the shared Costco membership card Sarah used every weekend, logged all devices out of my streaming accounts, and changed the passwords. I wasn't being vindictive. I was just acting like a woman who no longer had dependents. If Vivian was his mom, now Vivian could pay for his unlimited data. The next morning, the silence in the house was shattered by loud footsteps thumping down the wooden stairs. "Bethany," Sarah called out, marching into the kitchen holding her phone up like a piece of evidence. "Is the Wi-Fi down? My phone says no service, and I can't even get on the home network." I flipped the page of my morning newspaper. "I changed the Wi-Fi password last night," I answered without looking up. David walked in, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Why would you do that? And why is my phone saying SOS only?" I folded the paper neatly. "Since you're moving out to start your new life with Vivian, I went ahead and separated our accounts. You'll need to set up your own phone plans today." David stared at me, his jaw slightly dropping as the reality of adulthood finally introduced itself. The tension in the house immediately shifted from arrogant confidence to panicked irritation. David spent the next 2 hours on the phone with a customer service representative loudly complaining about activation fees while pacing across the backyard patio. Sarah, meanwhile, decided to cope by aggressively opening and slamming kitchen cabinets. "Where is the almond milk?" she demanded, standing in front of the open refrigerator. "And the organic eggs." "There's nothing in here but a few vegetables and your weird diet sodas." I picked up my gardening gloves from the counter. "I only bought groceries for 1 person this week," I explained calmly. "Since you're both leaving tomorrow, it didn't make sense to stock up on perishables. You can always grab breakfast at a diner." Sarah glared at me, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "We don't have time to go out. We have to pack. You couldn't have just made one last grocery run for us." "You're 30 years old, Sarah," I replied, my voice steady and entirely devoid of anger. "I am your mother-in-law, not your personal assistant. If you want breakfast, the grocery store is 3 miles down the road." She huffed, crossing her arms. "You're just doing this to be petty because David said he prefers my mother's house." I actually laughed, a short, genuine chuckle that seemed to confuse her even more. "Sarah, I am doing this because my responsibilities toward you both ended the moment you decided my home wasn't good enough for you. Enjoy packing." I walked out the back door and spent the entire morning tending to my hydrangeas. I didn't hover. I didn't offer to help them wrap their fragile dishes. I let them figure out exactly how difficult moving is when no one is silently managing the details behind the scenes. Through the kitchen window, I could see David looking stressed as he tried to fit a bulky television into a cardboard box that was entirely too small. I simply watered my flowers and hummed a quiet tune. Moving day arrived with gray skies and a thick layer of awkward silence. The moving truck pulled into the driveway right at 9 in the morning. David and Sarah hauled boxes out the front door, sweating and bickering over how to stack the furniture. I stood on the porch, holding a cup of coffee, staying entirely out of their way. David kept glancing over his shoulder, likely waiting for me to break down, apologize, or offer him a check to help with moving expenses. I offered nothing but a polite nod whenever they passed by. As they loaded the final box, Sarah walked toward my garage. "I'm going to take the patio heater," she announced casually, "since you never use it and Vivian's new patio is huge." I stepped directly into her path. "No, you aren't," I answered. She stopped blinking in surprise. "Are you serious? You're going to hoard a heater you don't even turn on?" "It belongs to my house," I stated, not raising my voice. Leave it right where it is. She muttered something under her breath and walked back to the truck. David finally approached the porch, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked exhausted, but his pride was still entirely intact. "Well, we're off," he declared, puffing his chest out slightly. "Don't expect us to visit much. Vivian has a lot planned for us." "I hope you find exactly what you're looking for, David," I replied. I held out my hand, palm up. "The keys, please." He frowned. "I'll just hold on to my copy, in case of an emergency." "No." I insisted, keeping my hand extended. "You don't live here anymore. I need both sets. Now." He stared at me for a long moment, realizing I was absolutely serious. Reluctantly, he dug into his pocket and dropped the heavy brass keys into my palm. Sarah tossed hers onto the porch railing without a word. They climbed into their car and drove away. I didn't wave. I simply turned around, walked inside, and locked the door. The first week alone was nothing short of glorious. There were no heavy footsteps above my bedroom at 2 a.m. No passive-aggressive notes left on the kitchen counter about the brand of dish soap I purchased. No piles of unwashed laundry mysteriously abandoned in the hallway. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and fresh lilies. I hired a local handyman to haul Sarah's ugly gray love seat to the local donation center and moved my vintage floral armchair back to its rightful spot by the large bay window. I took my time drinking my morning coffee. I watched the news without anyone mocking my choice of channel. I was discovering a version of myself I hadn't seen in decades. A woman who only had to answer to herself. Meanwhile, I didn't need to be a detective to know things weren't going perfectly for my son. David had posted a few pictures online of Vivian's massive luxury home. It looked like a museum. But 3 days later, a piece of mail arrived at my house, a notice from his car insurance company stating his policy had lapsed and he needed to secure new coverage immediately. I didn't forward the mail. I marked it, "Return to Sender," and dropped it in the blue postal box down the street. On Thursday evening, my cell phone buzzed on the coffee table. The caller ID displayed David's name. I let it ring. He called a second time. I turned the volume down and went back to reading my book. I wasn't playing a game. I simply had no desire to be his emotional dumping ground. When he needed a maid and a bank account, I was disposable. If he was calling now, it meant the reality of living with Vivian was finally starting to burn. 10 minutes later, a text message popped up on my screen. "Mom, Vivian expects us to pay $2,000 a month for the basement. We need to talk." I smiled, deleted the message, and turned the page of my novel. The piece broke on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen testing a new recipe for lemon pound cake when I heard the distinct sound of metal scratching against the front door lock. I wiped the flour off my hands and walked quietly to the foyer. Through the peephole, I saw David standing on the porch, furiously wiggling a freshly cut silver key into the deadbolt. He hadn't given me his real spare key on moving day. He had handed over an old one and kept a copy, assuming he could simply walk into my home whenever he pleased. But I hadn't survived 64 years of life by being naive. The day after they moved out, I called a locksmith and replaced every lock on the exterior doors. David cursed loudly, hitting the wooden frame with the side of his fist before finally pressing the doorbell. I waited exactly 30 seconds before opening the door, keeping the heavy metal chain engaged, so the door only opened a few inches. "What are you doing, David?" I asked through the narrow gap. He looked entirely soaked and deeply frustrated. "Why is my key not working?" "Did you change the locks?" "Yes. It's a standard security measure when tenants move out." I answered, my tone completely neutral. "Why are you trying to break into my house?" "I wasn't breaking in," he protested, his voice cracking slightly. I just needed to grab a few things I left in the attic. And I need a favor. Vivian is completely insane. She treats Sarah and me like the help. She makes us cook all her meals, and she's demanding rent that's higher than a luxury apartment. He looked at me with those wide, pleading eyes he used to use when he failed a math test in middle school. He expected me to unchain the door, wrap him in a towel, and invite him back inside. That sounds like a difficult situation, I noted calmly. You should probably discuss rent terms with your mom. David flinched as my words hit exactly where they were aimed. David gripped the edge of the wet door frame. Don't do that. You know what I meant. Vivian manipulated us. I need to borrow $5,000 just to get an apartment and get out of her basement. I'll pay you back. I looked at my son, noting the expensive designer jacket he was wearing, a jacket he bought using money he saved while living rent-free under my roof. I am not a bank, David, I replied evenly. You made a very clear decision about where your loyalties and your future lay. You said leaving me was the smartest choice you ever made. I am simply respecting your brilliant decision. I was angry, he shouted, stepping closer to the gap in the door. Sarah was stressing me out, and Vivian promised us the world. You're my mother. You're supposed to help me. I did help you, I corrected him. I gave you 3 years of free housing, free food, and free utilities. You chose to throw that away because you wanted luxury you didn't earn. Your choices belong to you now. So what? You're just going to let us be homeless, he demanded, resorting to his usual guilt tactics. You aren't homeless. You live in a mansion, I reminded him. I'll box up whatever you left in the attic and leave it on the porch tomorrow morning. Do not try to use a key on my door again. Before he could argue further, I gently pushed the door shut and slid the deadbolt into place. The loud, solid click echoed through the foyer. He stood on the porch for a few minutes, muttering angrily before finally stomping back to his car. I didn't feel a shred of guilt. Guilt is for people who have done something wrong. I had simply stopped preventing a grown man from experiencing the consequences of his own arrogance. I walked back to the kitchen, checked on my lemon pound cake, and poured myself another cup of tea. David's failure didn't stop Sarah from trying her own tactics. 2 days later, a bright yellow car pulled into my driveway. I was sitting on the front porch in my rocking chair, enjoying the afternoon breeze, when Sarah marched up the walkway, holding a bakery box tied with a red ribbon. She forced a massive, painfully unnatural smile onto her face. Hi, Bethany. I brought you those cherry scones you love from the downtown bakery. She reached the bottom of the steps and tried to walk past me toward the front door. I didn't move from my chair. Stop right there, Sarah, I instructed. She froze, holding the pastry box awkwardly. I just wanted to come inside and chat. We've had a rough week, and I realized how much I missed our morning coffees. She missed having someone else clean the coffee pot. I don't eat sugar anymore, I lied smoothly. And I don't have time for a chat. What do you want? Her fake smile dropped, revealing the panicked reality underneath. Vivian is threatening to kick us out. She says if we don't pay her the $2,000 by Friday, she's changing the security codes. David's credit cards are maxed. We just need to move back into your guest room for a couple of months. We'll be quiet, I swear. I looked at her, observing the sheer entitlement it took to treat someone like garbage, and then return, expecting a warm bed. No, I answered simply. No, she scoffed, her polite mask completely vanishing. You live in a 4-bedroom house by yourself. It's completely selfish to hoard all this space while your own family struggles. You have a mother, I reminded her. Go ask her to be less selfish. My mother is a monster, Sarah yelled, finally losing her temper. Then you two have something in common, I replied, standing up from my chair. Take your scones and leave my property. If you show up here again uninvited, I will have your car towed. Sarah stared at me in absolute shock. I turned my back, walked inside, and locked the door behind me. 6 months passed without another uninvited knock on my door. I eventually heard through a mutual family friend that David and Sarah couldn't afford Vivian's extortionate rent. Vivian, true to her controlling nature, actually kicked them out. They were forced to rent a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment in a noisy part of town, struggling to pay for their own groceries, utilities, and Wi-Fi. I didn't step in to rescue them. I didn't send a check. A bird will never learn to fly if you keep putting it back in the nest every time it jumps. As for me, my life blossomed. I turned David's old bedroom into a beautiful sewing and craft room. I joined a local walking club and met a wonderful retired architect named Richard, who actually knows how to treat people with respect. We spend our weekends exploring antique shops and drinking wine on my back patio, warmed by the very heater Sarah tried to steal. There was no dramatic cinematic reunion. David sent a generic text message on my birthday, which I replied to with a polite, simple, "Thank you." I still love my son, but I love him from a healthy distance. I no longer allow his chaos to dictate my peace. People often think that as a mother, you are required to endure endless disrespect just to keep your family close. But endurance isn't love. It's just slow suffering. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a selfish person is to let them hit the ground. I was sitting in my living room yesterday, looking at the vintage floral armchair sitting perfectly in the sunlight. I thought back to the day David stood in my hallway and proudly declared that leaving me was his smartest decision. I smiled, taking a sip of my coffee. He was absolutely right. His leaving really was the smartest decision he ever made, not for him, but for me. And the silence in my beautiful clean house has never sounded so incredibly sweet.